I noticed the lights for the first time at 2:17, when the sea below the rig went from black to faintly crowded, like something down there had decided to wake up early. I remember thinking it was a reflection glitch, maybe a passing vessel, until I leaned over the railing and realized the lights were too deep and too slow to belong to anything human. That was the night my supervisor finally admitted there were 11 strange rules for the night watch. Rules no one explains unless you've already broken one. I broke my first rule before anyone warned me, and the ocean has been keeping track ever since. I didn't learn Rule 1. Never acknowledge the lights if they change direction while you're watching them. From training or a safety briefing, I learned it because the man I was relieving wouldn't meet my eyes when he handed me the night log. His fingers shook just enough to leave a smudge on the paper, and he kept talking about the weather even though the air was still. I stood there longer than necessary, waiting for him to say something else, but all he did was pause like he was measuring how much silence I could tolerate. When he finally walked away, I realized he hadn't said goodbye. The rig at night doesn't feel abandoned. It feels preoccupied, like it has its own thoughts once the day crew leaves. I made my rounds slowly, boots pacing out a routine that was supposed to be calming, touching railings and doors the way people do when they want to reassure themselves. Something is solid. The ocean below was darker than the sky, a flat absence that made the lights on the rig seem harsher by contrast. I remember thinking that nothing good ever comes from staring too long into something that doesn't give anything back. My job wasn't complicated on paper, just observe, record, and report anything out of place. The problem is that out of place is a flexible idea when you're surrounded by nothing but water and metal for miles. I leaned over the railing out of habit more than curiosity, scanning the surface for debris or passing vessels. That was when I noticed the faint glow far below, too deep to be reflected light and too steady to be chance. At first the lights didn't bother me, because they behaved the way I expected them to. They drifted slowly upward, then paused, then faded, like something alive but distant enough to remain abstract. I told myself it was bioluminescence stirred by currents, the kind of explanation you reach for when you want to keep your pulse steady. Still, I found myself counting them without meaning to, noting the spacing like it might matter later. I straightened up and forced my attention back to the rig, annoyed at myself for lingering. Time stretches differently when you're alone, and I didn't realize how long I'd been walking until my legs started to feel heavy. The radio stayed quiet except for routine check-ins from other platforms, voices flattened by distance and protocol. Each time I responded, I kept my tone even, careful not to let anything extra slip through. There's comfort in procedure, and I clung to it harder than I'd like to admit. When I went back to the railing, the lights were still there, but something about them had changed. They were no longer drifting upward in that slow, natural way, but sliding sideways, keeping the same depth while rearranging themselves. The movement was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't already paying attention, which somehow made it worse. I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with exertion. I leaned closer without realizing it, my hands gripping the cold metal as if it could anchor my thoughts. The lights seemed to respond to my attention, not accelerating, just refining their motion like they were correcting a mistake. I remember thinking that acknowledgement isn't always verbal, that sometimes attention alone is enough to complete a loop. That thought scared me more than the lights themselves. I forced myself to step back, breaking eye contact the way you do with someone you don't want to invite into conversation. From a distance, the lights lost some of their definition, becoming just another strange thing in a long list of strange things associated with the sea. I focused on the hum of the rig beneath my feet, the predictable vibration of systems doing exactly what they were designed to do. Predictability felt precious in that moment. Minutes passed, maybe more, and I resisted the urge to check again, even though the thought pressed against me like an itch. There's a particular kind of mental fatigue that comes from restraint, from holding yourself still when every instinct says to confirm. I wondered how many people before me had failed simply because they needed certainty more than safety. The idea that survival might depend on ignoring something felt deeply unfair. Eventually I did look again, telling myself it was just to confirm they were gone. The lights had spread out, forming a loose arc that mirrored the curve of the rig above them. That alignment made my mouth go dry, because it suggested a level of awareness I wasn't ready to accept. I stood frozen, trying to remember if fear had always felt this quiet. I backed away without turning around, moving carefully so my retreat wouldn't look like panic. My heart felt heavy, each beat deliberate, as if my body was rationing motion. I thought about the man from earlier, about the way he couldn't meet my eyes, and wondered what he'd seen to make him like that. The ocean below remained calm, offering no confirmation or denial. The rest of the shift passed in fragments, tasks completed on autopilot, while my thoughts circled the same unanswered questions. I wrote my reports conservatively, sticking to observable facts and leaving out anything that couldn't be proven. There's a strange relief in omission, a sense that not naming something keeps it from fully existing. I told myself that discretion was part of the job, even if no one had said it out loud. When dawn finally began to thin the darkness, the lights were gone, leaving the water empty and ordinary. I should have felt relief, but instead there was a hollow sense of being evaluated and found interesting. As I headed inside, I caught my reflection in a window and barely recognized the tension in my own face. I understood then that whatever I'd avoided acknowledging had still noticed me, and that restraint might not always be enough to keep that attention from deepening. The first time I considered leaving the interior railing for the outer catwalk, I felt that peculiar hesitation that makes your skin notice air currents before your mind does. The night had settled into an almost unnatural stillness. The wind, usually a persistent companion, was absent, leaving the rig feeling suspended in its own private world. I reminded myself of Rule 2. Never step onto the outer catwalk when the wind is calm, even if it seems safe, while staring at the dark metal walkways stretching beyond the lights, and the words made my fingers tighten around the railing. Everything about calm nights screams safety, but the calmness here was deliberate, patient, like a predator's pause before deciding who it wants. I told myself it was just superstition again, the kind older night watchmen loved to cling to, yet the hair along my arms disagreed. The catwalk had always been intimidating in its structure, thin steel strips with the abyss yawning beneath, and normally the wind would thrum through its supports, masking the sense of exposure. On this night, though, the quiet made every step echo in a way that felt accusatory, like the rig itself was watching. My boots made careful contact, measured so as not to startle anything that might be waiting below. The absence of sound emphasized the sway of the platform beneath my weight, reminding me that even solid steel bends when the ocean insists. I thought about how many shifts had been completed with simple motions, yet this one felt different. Calm as it was, it carried a weight I couldn't quantify. Halfway across the catwalk, the lights below returned in patterns I hadn't noticed before, weaving like threads through the black, delicate but precise. I resisted the instinct to follow them with my eyes, knowing that attention could be acknowledgement in disguise. A small dry laugh escaped me when I realized I was explaining the lights to myself again, rehearsing the rules that felt like a personal firewall between me and something much larger. The calm night made the lights sharper, more deliberate, their arcs carving meaning into the water I couldn't name. Every rational thought whispered that I was imagining patterns, but the muscle memory in my body warned that imagination can be a trap when rules exist for a reason. Movement beneath the catwalk, subtle but enough to unsettle, made my pulse pick up without warning. I paused, gripping the metal with a tension that felt ancient in its origin, sensing that the calm was not neutral. The rig above hummed with its regular systems, but the wind's absence turned the mechanical sounds into a strange accompaniment to my unease. I remembered older crew stories of men being found slumped along this walkway, explanations vague, cautionary, their eyes wide with something more than fear. The calmness had been mentioned almost as an afterthought, a side note in every cautionary tale: never step when the wind is calm. A shift in the pattern of the lights below drew my gaze despite the warnings. They pulsed softly, almost lazily, but there was an underlying precision to the movement that tugged at a part of me that doesn't belong entirely to reason. The abyss beneath the catwalk seemed to inhale, edges of the rig silhouetted against faint luminescence, exaggerating how thin the platform felt beneath my boots. I reminded myself that the rule wasn't about wind itself, but the way calmness invites scrutiny, attention, and perhaps interaction. My breaths came shallow and uneven, but I kept moving, each step deliberate, counting them like one might count a prayer to stave off guilt. By the time I reached the midpoint, I realized that the quiet had changed, not just the absence of wind, but the way the rig itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Shadows, the ones that weren't supposed to exist, flickered across the steel supports and reflected dimly on the water, hinting at presence without form. Every logical explanation I tried felt flimsy, a scaffold too weak to hold the weight of intuition. I thought about reporting this on the log, but even the idea of writing it down felt like giving permission, a subtle acknowledgement I couldn't afford. The rule existed to prevent that exact moment, to prevent me from stepping into alignment with something I couldn't yet name. A sudden mental calculation reminded me of the distance to the edge, how a misstep could send me down to a watery grave before anyone realized. I slowed my pace further, listening to the hum of machinery that suddenly sounded louder, sharper, as though its vibrations were trying to convey urgency. The calm air pressed against my skin differently now, making each movement feel broadcasted in a way that wasn't physically possible. I thought about my predecessor, about how he always said that the catwalk tests more than balance. It tests attention, patience, and restraint. The light shifted again below, forming arcs that mirrored the walkways, a cruel mimicry of the metal lattice I relied on. My body tightened, as if something in the water was aware of my position relative to them. The calm night made it impossible to tell if the rig itself was protective or complicit. I felt a creeping exhaustion, not from fatigue, but from the mental exertion of holding still and not acknowledging patterns. Each step was now a negotiation with my own instincts, the rule etched like an iron bar across my mind. When I finally reached the far side and turned back toward the main platform, the perspective of the lights struck me differently. They were deliberate, organized in ways that suggested observation, not randomness. The realization hit that rule 2, never step onto the outer catwalk when the wind is calm, even if it seems safe, wasn't just advice. It was a line drawn to separate me from consequences I wasn't equipped to understand. I didn't want to look at the lights again, and yet I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder. I descended the ladder slowly, careful to let my weight settle on each rung, the cold steel gripping my palms as reassurance. The lights seemed to linger in place, mocking my retreat, their arcs echoing the curve of the catwalk I had just left. Every logical explanation felt hollow against the visceral certainty that the calm night had been a test, that the platform had allowed me to measure my own adherence to something I didn't yet fully understand. By the time I re-entered the interior safety rails, the sun had begun to hint at dawn, and the quiet remained, stubborn and unbroken, as though it expected my next move to be flawed. The first time I considered leaving the interior railing for the outer catwalk, I felt that peculiar hesitation that makes your skin notice air currents before your mind does. The night had settled into an almost unnatural stillness. The wind, usually a persistent companion, was absent, leaving the rig feeling suspended in its own private world. I reminded myself of Rule 2, never step onto the outer catwalk when the wind is calm, even if it seems safe, while staring at the dark metal walkways stretching beyond the lights. And the words made my fingers tighten around the railing. Everything about calm nights screams safety, but the calmness here was deliberate, patient, like a predator's pause before deciding who it wants. I told myself it was just superstition again, the kind older night watchmen loved to cling to. Yet the hair along my arms disagreed. The catwalk had always been intimidating in its structure, thin steel strips with the abyss yawning beneath, and normally the wind would thrum through its supports, masking the sense of exposure. On this night, though, the quiet made every step echo in a way that felt accusatory, like the rig itself was watching. My boots made careful contact, measured so as not to startle anything that might be waiting below. The absence of sound emphasized the sway of the platform beneath my weight, reminding me that even solid steel bends when the ocean insists. I thought about how many shifts had been completed with simple motions, yet this one felt different. Calm as it was, it carried a weight I couldn't quantify. Halfway across the catwalk, the lights below returned in patterns I hadn't noticed before, weaving like threads through the black, delicate but precise. I resisted the instinct to follow them with my eyes, knowing that attention could be acknowledgement in disguise. A small, dry laugh escaped me when I realized I was explaining the lights to myself again, rehearsing the rules that felt like a personal firewall between me and something much larger. The calm night made the lights sharper, more deliberate, their arcs carving meaning into the water I couldn't name. Every rational thought whispered that I was imagining patterns, but the muscle memory in my body warned that imagination can be a trap when rules exist for a reason. Movement beneath the catwalk, subtle but enough to unsettle, made my pulse pick up without warning. I paused, gripping the metal with a tension that felt ancient in its origin, sensing that the calm was not neutral. The rig above hummed with its regular systems, but the wind's absence turned the mechanical sounds into a strange accompaniment to my unease. I remembered older crew stories of men being found slumped along this walkway, explanations vague, cautionary, their eyes wide with something more than fear. The calmness had been mentioned almost as an afterthought, a side note in every cautionary tale: never step when the wind is calm. A shift in the pattern of the lights below drew my gaze despite the warnings. They pulsed softly, almost lazily, but there was an underlying precision to the movement that tugged at a part of me that doesn't belong entirely to reason. The abyss beneath the catwalk seemed to inhale, edges of the rig silhouetted against faint luminescence, exaggerating how thin the platform felt beneath my boots. I reminded myself that the rule wasn't about wind itself, but the way calmness invites scrutiny, attention, and perhaps interaction. My breaths came shallow and uneven, but I kept moving, each step deliberate, counting them like one might count a prayer to stave off guilt. By the time I reached the midpoint, I realized that the quiet had changed, not just the absence of wind, but the way the rig itself seemed to hold its breath waiting. Shadows, the ones that weren't supposed to exist, flickered across the steel supports and reflected dimly on the water, hinting at presence without form. Every logical explanation I tried felt flimsy, a scaffold too weak to hold the weight of intuition. I thought about reporting this on the log, but even the idea of writing it down felt like giving permission, a subtle acknowledgement I couldn't afford. The rule existed to prevent that exact moment, to prevent me from stepping into alignment with something I couldn't yet name. A sudden mental calculation reminded me of the distance to the edge, how a misstep could send me down to a watery grave before anyone realized. I slowed my pace further, listening to the hum of machinery that suddenly sounded louder, sharper, as though its vibrations were trying to convey urgency. The calm air pressed against my skin differently now, making each movement feel broadcasted in a way that wasn't physically possible. I thought about my predecessor, about how he always said that the catwalk tests more than balance. It tests attention, patience, and restraint. The lights shifted again below, forming arcs that mirrored the walkways, a cruel mimicry of the metal lattice I relied on. My body tightened as if something in the water was aware of my position relative to them. The calm night made it impossible to tell if the rig itself was protective or complicit. I felt a creeping exhaustion, not from fatigue, but from the mental exertion of holding still and not acknowledging patterns. Each step was now a negotiation with my own instincts, the rule etched like an iron bar across my mind. When I finally reached the far side and turned back toward the main platform, the perspective of the lights struck me differently. They were deliberate, organized in ways that suggested observation, not randomness. The realization hit that Rule 2, never step onto the outer catwalk when the wind is calm, even if it seems safe, wasn't just advice, it was a line drawn to separate me from consequences I wasn't equipped to understand. I didn't want to look at the lights again, and yet I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder. I descended the ladder slowly, careful to let my weight settle on each rung, the cold steel gripping my palms as reassurance. The lights seemed to linger in place, mocking my retreat, their arcs echoing the curve of the catwalk I had just left. Every logical explanation felt hollow against the visceral certainty that the calm night had been a test, that the platform had allowed me to measure my own adherence to something I didn't yet fully understand. By the time I re-entered the interior safety rails, the sun had begun to hint at dawn, and the quiet remained, stubborn and unbroken, as though it expected my next move to be flawed. The first time I considered reaching for my camera, I hesitated, because instinct screamed that some things are better remembered in memory than on a screen. I reminded myself of Rule 3. Never record or photograph the lights, even if you think it's just for documentation. While feeling the cold metal of the railing press into my palms, the lights below flickering in patterns too deliberate to dismiss, my rational mind argued that evidence would justify my unease, that a recording could protect me if anyone asked. But deep down, I knew that the warning existed, because attention in that form, the act of freezing the lights into an object, crossed a line I wasn't meant to understand yet. My fingers hovered over the camera, itching to obey curiosity, and I had to shake them as if waking from a dream. The rig was quieter than usual that night, machinery humming in monotonous agreement, a lullaby of false reassurance. Every step I took toward the observation deck made me acutely aware of how exposed I was, how small the steel structure seemed against the immensity of the ocean below. The lights were closer than before, scattered like stars fallen into deep water, each one precise and deliberate, as if aware I was weighing the option to document. I clenched the camera tight, my knuckles white, reminding myself that the rule wasn't a guideline or superstition, it was protection. I could see my own reflection in the lens, doubled mirrored, and I realized it had become a tool, not for me, but for something else watching silently. Trying to justify the act of recording felt like bargaining with the inevitable. I told myself I'd review the footage after my shift, that evidence could clarify what my senses could not. The first frame captured the smallest flicker, and my stomach sank as the glow responded, elongating like a brushstroke that wasn't part of nature. Every instinct in my body shouted that the lights recognized the intention behind the lens, that they were adjusting to my act before it even happened. I lowered the camera, setting it down with hands that shook, despite every effort to remain calm. The rule lingered in my mind like an iron weight, undeniable in its clarity. Walking along the inner walkways, I realized I was measuring distances differently. Every railing, bolt, and support beam, a reminder that the rule existed to keep me from leaving evidence of myself. The lights moved beneath me, in shapes that suggested deliberation, curving around debris, threading through darkness like invisible currents I couldn't feel. I had the nagging suspicion that the moment I pressed record, I would have crossed a line, one that wouldn't let me go unnoticed. The idea of discretion became obsessive. I counted steps and breaths, letting the rule dictate motion instead of curiosity. When I glanced down again, the lights had multiplied, forming patterns too regular to be coincidental, too perfect to be dismissed as reflection. It was almost as though they were rehearsing, anticipating documentation, testing the boundaries of observation. I kept my gaze steady, aware that any tilt of the head or adjustment of the camera could be read as acknowledgement. I felt absurd for attributing awareness to water and light, yet nothing about this night adhered to the ordinary. Every instinct insisted the rule was not for safety alone, but for maintaining a fragile balance between what is seen and what is left unseen. By the midpoint of my shift, exhaustion began to mingle with unease, creating a sensation I couldn't describe except as alert fatigue. I caught myself rehearsing excuses for anyone who might ask why I hadn't documented the lights. Technical failure, battery drain, human error. All of them sounded hollow in my own ears. The ocean below seemed to pulse faintly with the rhythm of my heartbeat, a subtle encouragement to test boundaries I could not afford to test. I reminded myself once more that Rule 3, never record or photograph the lights, even if you think it's just for documentation, was a rule, not a suggestion. Every glance over the railing felt heavier as the night progressed, like the lights were gradually mapping the edges of the rig with invisible threads that only I could feel. I measured distance and angle in my mind, noting the subtle shifts of each glow, knowing that a photograph would have betrayed both the motion and the intent. My body insisted on compliance, walking slowly, deliberately, letting the rig's creaks and groans mask my attention. The act of restraint became almost sacred, a careful choreography between fear, obedience, and survival. Toward the end of the shift, the light seemed to settle into a rhythm, a quiet ordering of space that made everything beneath the rig feel like a miniature, controlled universe. The temptation to grab the camera flared once more, a spike of curiosity that made my pulse skip. I shook it off, letting my eyes drift without the mechanical interference of a lens, trusting in the rule even as doubt gnawed. The lights didn't respond to distance or angle, only to intention, and I was beginning to realize the subtlety embedded in every rule up to this point. By the time dawn started to thin the darkness, I could feel my muscles relax, though my mind remained taut. The light slowly receded, blending back into the black, leaving me with the strange, empty relief that came from obedience. There was no applause for following the rule, no confirmation that restraint had succeeded, only the quiet sense of continuing the night unbroken. As I stepped inside and shut the door behind me, I felt the weight of documentation left undone, realizing that the absence of evidence didn't lessen the experience, it magnified it in ways I could not yet articulate. I remember sitting at the narrow desk, pen hovering over the logbook, as if hesitation alone could keep me safe, because I knew Rule 5, never log the lights in the official report before sunrise, no matter how harmless they seem. The lights outside the reinforced window flickered faintly in the black water below, shifting in patterns I didn't yet understand, but could feel in my bones. My fingers itched to write, to capture the proof that I was seeing something extraordinary, but every instinct told me that doing so now would be a mistake. I traced the edge of the paper with my thumb, feeling the grooves of older entries, and imagined those words had been written by men who'd vanished before sunrise, just like this one. The logbook was heavy in my hands, layered with decades of entries, the weight of cumulative knowledge pressing down like sediment. Each page held sterile details of equipment checks, weather reports, and routine observations, but there were gaps, deliberate omissions that previous night watchmen left to preserve some unspoken boundary. I turned the pages slowly, counting them in a futile attempt to justify writing the lights down. They seemed to judge me from below, even through the thick glass, reminding me that the rule wasn't arbitrary. It existed for a reason I didn't yet fully comprehend. The light's glow was soft, almost polite, but precise enough that I sensed intention, as if they were aware of my internal debate and timing. I tapped the pen against the margin, a faint noise that sounded louder than it should have in the stillness of the night. The temptation to record every detail overwhelmed my thoughts, each tick of the second hand amplifying the urge to commit the unusual patterns to paper. I thought of the cameras, the old digital recorders I'd been tempted to use, and the same rule applied: restraint was survival. Logging too early, even with good intent, could anchor something that was meant to drift, could make the observation permanent in a way that might not end well. The lights below seemed to shift slightly, almost teasing, as if sensing my indecision, and I could feel the taut wire of dread stretching through my chest. I tried to distract myself with routine entries, temperature readings, machinery checks, generator performance, all the mundane details that occupied the desk without drawing attention. Each line was a small exercise in control, a way to remind myself that I still had dominion over what went onto the page. The empty section where I wanted to write about the lights felt accusatory, almost like a silent admonishment for even considering breaking the rule. I could feel the pulse of the rig beneath my palms, a steady vibration contrasting the unpredictable movement of the lights, grounding me as I battled the urge to document. The more I looked, the more I realized that the ocean had its own rhythm, and recording anything before sunrise might be seen as intrusion. Minutes stretched into hours, each one feeling heavier than the last. The lights began to form arcs, tracing invisible boundaries beneath the rig with calculated precision. I counted my breaths and the scratches of pen across paper, trying to measure time against the pulse of the deep. Every instinct warned me that committing words to paper before daylight was an invitation, not a protection. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips as I hovered over the logbook, knowing that one hasty stroke could leave a permanent mark of recognition. The rig itself seemed to quiet in anticipation, the usual hum and mechanical chatter receding as if to emphasize my indecision. I tried writing partial sentences, vague notes about observations without naming the lights, but even those attempts felt wrong. Each word felt like it could carry meaning, convey more than intended, and the weight of the rule pressed down. I realized that the act of writing itself was scrutinized, that intention could be seen even without sound or motion. The lights seemed to drift slightly closer in response to my hesitation, their glow soft but deliberate, forming curves and lines that mirrored the structure above. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes for a moment, trying to convince myself that omission was safety, that patience could protect me when logic could not. By the midpoint of the night, the air inside the rig felt heavy, humid with salt and anticipation. The lights below remained visible, still in their quiet choreography, and I understood that compliance with the rule demanded more than inaction. It demanded mental restraint. Every glance at the logbook required deliberate thought. Every motion of the pen weighed against consequences I could not see. I thought about my predecessor, about nights when he had remained silent and omitted the anomalies, and how that silence had likely been the only thing keeping him intact. I tried to imagine the sunrise as a shield, a line after which recording could exist without consequence, though I had no guarantee that this timing would matter at all. The tension in my shoulders increased as I resisted the urge to glance down at the water for detail, to quantify the arcs, the lines, the peculiar geometries the lights traced. Obedience became its own kind of labor, the effort not in lifting the pen, but in holding my mind steady, refusing to impose permanence on something meant to remain unrecorded until the rule allowed it. Each moment of restraint felt monumental, like a fragile negotiation with forces unseen yet palpable. The dim reflection of the lights on the rig's metal surfaces seemed almost to mock me, teasing the inner conflict between documentation and survival. When the first hints of dawn started to thin the darkness, the lights below became harder to discern, merging back into the black water until their patterns were only suggested, not observed directly. I finally allowed my hands to relax, setting the pen down and exhaling in a slow, deliberate release. The logbook remained blank, where the anomaly could have been recorded, the empty space heavy with unspoken understanding. Compliance had not felt like relief, only the quiet suspension of attention and acknowledgement, a temporary reprieve. The rig, the ocean, and the lights had waited with patient scrutiny, and now that I had honored the rule, I could finally move, though unease lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. I stood, feeling the morning air beginning to filter in, and realized the light's lesson: restraint is active, not passive. Recording before sunrise would have anchored something that wanted to remain in motion, and perhaps even my careful waiting had been noted. My mind felt taut, stretched over the invisible boundary set by the rule, as if compliance had been measured by invisible hands. I closed the logbook fully, and the sound of its cover snapping echoed more loudly than it should have, a reminder that even small actions carry weight. The lights had faded, but the memory of them, and of obeying the rule, would follow me for the remainder of my shift. When I left the desk and headed toward the interior platform, I felt an odd mixture of exhaustion and vigilance. Every step, every glance was tempered by the knowledge that the absence of written acknowledgement did not erase the experience, only delayed it. Compliance had been maintained, the rule honored, and yet a quiet tension remained, like something waiting to see if I would falter later. The morning was no relief, only a transition from one state of awareness to another, each rule reinforcing the boundaries that kept me on the rig, and for now safe. By the time the sun had fully risen, the lights had disappeared beneath the water, leaving the ocean seemingly ordinary. I remained uneasy, realizing that the act of waiting had been observed in some intangible way. The rule had not only guided my actions, but shaped the experience itself, teaching the subtlety of restraint and timing. I knew that recording too soon could have consequences I was not prepared to face, and that the patience demanded by Rule 5 never logged the lights in the official report before sunrise, no matter how harmless they seem, was more than protocol, it was survival. I felt the metal railing bite into my palms as I paused halfway along the upper deck, a chill creeping up my spine because I knew Rule 6. Never approach the edge of the rig alone when the lights gather directly beneath you. The ocean stretched out in black silence, broken only by faint pools of light clustering unnaturally below, moving in deliberate, measured arcs that defied the water's current. My boots felt heavier with every step I considered, as if the rig itself was aware of my hesitation. I could sense the warning pulse of the rule, not as words in my head but as a subtle tightening in my chest, urging me to remain cautious. It wasn't just instruction, it was an understanding that the consequences of ignoring it weren't theoretical. The wind above had died down again, leaving only the faint hum of machinery as a backdrop to the light's slow choreography. Each glow seemed to respond to the way my body shifted, drawing attention in ways I didn't want acknowledged. I reminded myself to focus on the work at hand, checking gauges, inspecting welds, but the edges of my vision betrayed me, pulling my gaze back toward the hypnotic clustering below. It was an unnatural patience that made me uncomfortable. The lights weren't rushing, weren't aggressive, but they were deliberate, testing boundaries with a quiet persistence that left no room for mistake. Every instinct screamed that stepping closer alone would violate some invisible boundary. I took a single cautious step forward, telling myself it was just curiosity, a need to understand spatial relationships on the deck. But the lights below tightened, forming lines and arcs that mirrored the rig itself. The realization hit me like cold water. Observation alone might not be enough. My body reacted instinctively, tension coiling in my shoulders and jaw as I tried to reconcile fascination with the rigid safety imposed by the rule. The rig beneath my feet seemed more precarious than ever, every bolt and grating a reminder that the structure only partially controlled what lurked below. My focus became fractured between the mechanics of steel and the hypnotic, deliberate motion of the lights. I reminded myself that I was alone up here, and that loneliness carries its own weight, particularly when facing patterns you can't fully interpret. The lights weren't just visual phenomena. They occupied space with intention, and even the faintest acknowledgement could alter the way they behaved. I took a careful step backward, testing distance and maintaining balance, but my gaze remained fixed, unwilling to turn away. The rule wasn't about physical proximity alone. It governed the psychological space between observer and observed, insisting that a boundary be respected even when it could easily be ignored. I felt the cold pressing against my skin, the salt air sharpen my lungs, as the lights continued their silent arcs. Every nerve in my body felt the strain of vigilance. The edges of the rig appeared farther away than they should have, each movement magnified by awareness. I realized how easily one could misjudge distance or overestimate stability when the ocean and light conspired together. The calmness above, the predictable metal beneath, and the unrelenting unpredictability below created a tension that wasn't purely physical. It was moral, instinctual. I thought about why the rule had been written in the first place. Not to frighten, not to restrain curiosity, but to create a protective margin between human presence and forces that did not obey human logic. I tried to distract myself with small repetitive motions, checking handrails, brushing salt off bolts, realigning a stray rope, anything to keep my mind from focusing solely on the lights clustering. Each motion reminded me how precarious the balance was between normal duty and the unseen that waited beneath. The more I resisted, the more the lights seemed aware, shaping themselves into patterns that echoed the framework of the rig as if acknowledging my restraint. I realized the rule's power wasn't in forbidding proximity, it was in dictating attention, shaping behavior through the subtle pressure of enforced respect. Minutes passed, though time lost meaning under the weight of anticipation. My eyes strained against darkness, following each flicker and shimmer, counting lines and arcs without allowing myself to cross toward them. I could feel the risk of a misstep, not just physical but psychological. Stepping too close alone would compromise more than stability. It would compromise safety in ways I couldn't quantify. My chest tightened as if the rig were pressing against me, a reminder that obedience was more than adherence to instruction. It was the difference between remaining whole and inviting something unknowable to intrude. Eventually, the lights began to disperse slightly, retreating into the shadows, leaving only a faint trace of motion beneath the waves. My muscles, taut from tension, relaxed incrementally, though the mental strain lingered. I had remained compliant, respecting Rule 6, never approach the edge of the rig alone when the lights gather directly beneath you, and yet the knowledge that the lights had noticed my hesitation followed me. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was recognition of another moment survived, another boundary maintained. The rig felt both safer and heavier, the contrast leaving me unsettled in ways only silence and distance could explain. By the end of my watch, I knew the lesson of Rule 6 had settled into my bones. Curiosity must be balanced with caution, presence with restraint. I descended from the upper deck carefully, every movement deliberate, aware that the lights might observe even as they faded. Compliance had been maintained, survival sustained, and yet the quiet, patient intelligence beneath the surface remained, waiting for the next shift, the next observer, the next breach. I felt the tremor in my hands as I adjusted my flashlight, knowing that Rule 7, never attempt to communicate with the lights, even indirectly through gestures, signals, or sounds, existed for a reason, far beyond my understanding. The ocean below remained black, but the lights pulsed faintly, moving in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost conversational in their rhythm. My first instinct was to wave or tap on metal to see if I could elicit a response, but something deep in my memory screamed that interaction was forbidden. Even the tiniest motion, a hand raised, a whistle of breath, could register in ways my mind couldn't anticipate, and I found myself frozen in place. I realized that restraint was no longer optional. It was necessary to survival. The rig's high catwalks amplified every small noise, making even the softest footstep resonate like a warning. I shifted slightly, careful not to make any abrupt motion that could be interpreted as an invitation. The light's arcs below seemed to twist subtly in response to my attention, though never directly toward me, always just beyond, like a shadow of intention. My fingers tightened around the railing, grounding me, and I reminded myself that Rule 7 was absolute. Communication of any kind could provoke observation that was better left untested. I imagined what would happen if someone else had ignored this, and the memory of warnings whispered by predecessors pressed heavily on my consciousness. The idea of communication lingered in my thoughts, almost involuntarily, as if curiosity was a siren I couldn't entirely ignore. My eyes traced the lines the lights formed, noting the arcs, clusters, and subtle pauses, but I resisted the urge to respond in any way. My voice was silent, my hands steady, even as my mind cataloged each movement with obsessive care. I realized that the rule wasn't about obedience alone, but about preserving distance, not just physical, but cognitive. Every signal sent, every gesture made, could be interpreted, amplified, or held against me in ways I would never witness directly. I remembered a brief story from one of the older night watchmen, about a man who had tried tapping on a support beam, attempting to see if the lights understood rhythm. He had returned pale, quiet, his gaze distant, and never elaborated on what happened. That story wasn't cautionary exaggeration, it was evidence of what ignoring Rule 7 could do. The lights didn't need words to communicate. They seemed aware, perceptive, patient in ways I could sense, but never describe. I hugged the railing closer, counting steps to distract myself from the urge to signal, my mind aware that each fraction of attention could carry unintended weight. As the shift progressed, subtle environmental cues seemed amplified. The wind shifted momentarily, the metal beneath my boots groaned, and the faint pulse of machinery took on a rhythm that coincided almost eerily with the light's movements. I could feel the temptation to respond rising, a mix of fear, curiosity, and disbelief pressing against my rational mind. Every instinct told me that reaching out, even in jest or testing, could destabilize the precarious balance enforced by the rules. I reminded myself again, Rule 7, never attempt to communicate with the lights, even indirectly, through gestures, signals, or sounds, was a boundary I was not permitted to test. Time lost all usual meaning as I remained vigilant. Each pulse of light became a subtle conversation I was forbidden to join, an intelligence I had to observe silently. My limbs grew tense, muscles coiled from holding posture and restraint, while my mind cataloged every nuance without participation. The lights moved as if aware I was watching, refining their arcs, grouping in clusters, retreating, then pausing, always deliberate, always just out of reach. Obedience became an exercise in mental endurance, a commitment to maintaining the boundary the rule imposed. By the midpoint of the night, the tension in my chest had solidified into an almost physical weight. I noted that my own heartbeat had slowed, a subconscious effort to minimize audible cues, while my eyes tracked the shifting patterns below. Even breathing seemed excessive, potentially communicative, so I counted instead, focusing on internal rhythms to maintain composure. The rule was not merely guidance, it was a tether, keeping my actions in alignment with survival. I understood that communication, even unintentional, could invite consequences I couldn't predict. Forces patient and aware in ways that defied logic. Toward the end of the night, the light's movement became subtler, almost imperceptible, yet I felt the same scrutiny. My muscles ached from holding position, my mind strained from constant observation, and I realized how thoroughly Rule 7 shaped behavior, perception, and cognition. It wasn't about fear alone, it was about enforcing a distance that preserved life. I finally allowed myself to shift slightly, releasing the tension in my shoulders just enough to remain functional, yet careful not to breach the invisible line between attention and interaction. When the first hints of sunrise touched the horizon, the lights below began to fade, leaving only the empty black of the ocean. I had not moved, gestured, or made a single sound directed at them, honoring Rule 7 through restraint and focus. Compliance had been exhausting, but the absence of consequence reinforced the rule's power. Observing without participating preserved some fragile equilibrium. Even as the day crept in, I knew the lights, the rules, and the rig's invisible intelligence would continue to demand vigilance on the next night. I felt the cold metal of the hatch beneath my fingertips, and immediately remembered Rule 8. Never linger near the maintenance hatches at night, while the lights are in view. The ocean outside was impossibly black, broken only by the faint pulsing arcs of light, clustering beneath the rig, as if mapping the very structure I stood on. My first instinct was to inspect the hatch, check the bolts and seams. It was routine, but hesitation gripped me like ice. Every story I had heard about past shifts warned against curiosity near these openings, when the lights were active, and yet I could feel the invisible boundary drawing tighter, pressing me away from the temptation to lean too close. The rule wasn't just precaution, it was a safeguard against something I could not articulate. The deck beneath my boots creaked unevenly, the rig settling into its natural rhythm, while the lights below moved in slow, deliberate patterns, almost aware of my presence. I tried to focus on maintenance logs, cleaning, or minor adjustments to machinery nearby, anything to keep my mind from drifting to the hatch. Each pulse of light seemed to accentuate the danger, marking edges of space I was forbidden to explore. Even thinking about leaning over for a closer look felt like testing the water with bare hands, dangerous in its subtlety. My fingers traced the seams of the hatch lightly, just enough to confirm integrity without violating the rule, but my eyes constantly flicked to the lights, drawn despite warning. I reminded myself why the rule existed. Previous night watchmen had learned through consequences. I was too young to have witnessed firsthand. The hatches were portals of vulnerability, mechanical weak points amplified by the curious energy below, and the lights seemed to cluster near them, almost in anticipation of mistakes. My body tensed reflexively, shoulders tight, knees slightly bent, ready to retreat. Even my breathing felt like a broadcast, a signal I wasn't allowed to send. I understood then that Rule 8 wasn't about preventing physical accidents. It was about minimizing exposure to forces I could neither predict nor control. As I hovered near the hatch, trying to maintain a balance between routine and caution, the lights moved in arcs I had never noticed before, forming elongated paths that hinted at geometry I didn't comprehend. Every instinct urged me to step back, yet curiosity fought against the rigid adherence demanded by the rule. The faint reflection of lights on metal surfaces created illusions of motion around me, pulling my attention in ways that felt instinctive, dangerous, and almost sentient. I focused on the tactile sensations, the cold, the ridges, the bolts, grounding myself in what I could control, leaving the rest to observation. Time stretched, the night seemed endless, the lights below shifting imperceptibly, each subtle movement a reminder that I was being watched in ways I could not measure. I measured my attention carefully, ensuring every glance at the hatches was quick, deliberate, and justified by maintenance, never lingering out of curiosity. Every heartbeat seemed amplified in the quiet, echoing across metal beams and grating, and I realized that mental discipline was as critical as physical restraint. I was a part of the rig tonight, performing duties in harmony with rules that were less about procedure and more about survival, the lights serving as a silent teacher. By the midpoint of my shift, the tension became almost unbearable, a low hum of dread pressing against the edges of my consciousness. I kept moving along the deck, never loitering in one spot, aware that even brief hesitation near a hatch could invite consequences. The lights shifted again, forming clusters that reflected my movements in an uncanny mimicry. My hands ached from gripping railings, my eyes strained from constant observation, and I realized that compliance with Rule 8 required total immersion in vigilance, the kind that left no room for distraction. Even instinctive glances could be interpreted by the lights as signals of intent. I forced my attention to mundane tasks, inspecting rust spots, tightening a few loose screws, checking the rig's lighting panels. Each small motion grounded me, reinforcing my obedience, while the lights continued their silent, deliberate dance beneath the rig. I imagined what might have happened to anyone who ignored this rule, and a quiet shiver ran down my spine. The hatches were portals, not just physically, but metaphorically, spaces where the wrong action could create a feedback loop of observation and consequence. Remaining compliant felt both protective and suffocating at once. As dawn approached, the light's arcs grew faint, merging back into the black water, leaving only residual luminescence that barely touched the edges of the rig. I finally allowed myself a moment of relief, though my body remained taut, aware that the night had demanded more than routine vigilance. The hatch beneath my fingertips felt ordinary again, cold and metal, but the memory of the light's deliberate clustering beneath it lingered like a warning. I had honored Rule 8, avoided temptation, and survived another night, yet I knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. The lesson of restraint, enforced by the lights and the rule, would remain, silently shaping every step I took, until the next night. I remember the moment vividly when a wrench slipped from my grip and teetered on the edge, threatening to fall into the dark waters below. The instinct to save it almost overpowered me, but I immediately thought of Rule 9. Never attempt to retrieve objects that have fallen toward the lights, no matter their value. The wrench would have been lost, yes, but more importantly, reaching for it would have placed me in direct proximity to the pulsing arcs below, violating a boundary I was not meant to test. My heart hammered as I hesitated, gripping the railing instead of leaning over, my body screaming that curiosity and practicality were worthless when weighed against survival. I swallowed hard, letting the metal slip into the shadows, and instantly felt the unspoken judgment of the rule press down like invisible hands. The ocean below seemed to respond in kind, the lights shifting subtly, as if acknowledging the near breach. The urge to reclaim the wrench gnawed at me, mingling frustration and fear in a way that made the deck beneath my feet feel narrower, more precarious. I reminded myself that every object that touched the waters near the lights, became more than mere metal. It became a signal, a temptation, a bridge I was forbidden to cross. My hands remained clasped tightly around the cold railing, knuckles white, as I watched the shadows swallow the falling wrench. The rule had not been written as a guideline. It existed as a buffer between human interference and the intelligence lurking beneath. Each minute after the fall stretched like hours. I scanned the lights obsessively, noting arcs and patterns that might have been disrupted by my near action. My mind cataloged every subtle movement, calculating how close the wrench might have passed to the nearest glow, imagining consequences I couldn't fully comprehend. The lights didn't behave with aggression, but their presence carried weight, a patient insistence that boundaries be observed. Even the suggestion of crossing the line, extending a hand toward a falling object, felt heavy, like bending a metal bar that wanted to spring back with force. I felt both awe and terror, a mixture only reinforced by the silent insistence of the rule. I remembered stories from the older night watchmen, of tools, notes, or stray personal items lost to the ocean, never retrieved. They emphasized that objects were not merely lost. They became catalysts, something that drew attention, anchored observation, or provoked response from forces we couldn't quantify. My imagination filled in possibilities, each more unsettling than the last, metallic arcs shifting in synchronized motion, lights converging on points where human interference had occurred, the faint sensation of being watched in ways beyond vision. I understood that Rule 9 extended beyond caution. It was about respecting the autonomy of the environment below, an environment that demanded compliance even when it defied reason. Hours passed with my gaze fixed, noting each change in the light's formation, reminding myself repeatedly why I had allowed the wrench to disappear. Each time I shifted, my weight against the railing emphasized restraint, a conscious act of adherence to a protocol that combined instinct, survival, and fear. My arms ached, my eyes strained, but every ache was preferable to the unknown consequences of reaching. The patience demanded by the rule became a discipline, training me to accept loss as a necessary measure of life, teaching that some instincts, curiosity, possession, pride, had no place when the lights were near. At one point, I contemplated tossing a small piece of scrap into the water, testing if it would provoke a reaction or vanish harmlessly. Immediately, my mind recoiled, recalling Rule 9 and the wrench, and I realized the gravity of interference. The lights didn't need provocation, they demanded observation, and any attempt at interaction, retrieving, tossing, signaling, risked consequences I could not predict. The hesitation in that moment was a reminder that the rule was less about the objects themselves and more about human restraint, the discipline to let curiosity die before it became a liability. As dawn approached, the lights gradually receded, their arcs dissolving into the vast blackness, leaving the ocean deceptively ordinary again. The wrench was gone, swept away by currents, or left to rest among the depths, and I could only reflect on the rule's lesson, preservation of self through obedience to limits. My muscles loosened slightly, but the mental imprint of restraint remained. Compliance had been taxing, frustrating, and alien, yet undeniably necessary. The lights, silent and deliberate, had maintained the boundary, and I had survived another night by respecting Rule 9. Never attempt to retrieve objects that have fallen toward the lights, no matter their value. Even as I descended to the interior platform, I knew the lesson of Rule 9 would linger. Loss was part of the equation. Curiosity was a dangerous companion. The ocean and its lights demanded vigilance and respect, and each choice carried weight far beyond immediate comprehension. Survival depended not on skill or bravery, but on the discipline to let go when instinct screamed otherwise, trusting that obedience, patience, and restraint were the only things keeping me whole. By the time my eyes started burning and my knees felt hollow, I understood why Rule 10 never sleep during your shift, even if the rig feels calm and the lights are gone, but had been written in such blunt language. The sea was empty that night, no movement beneath the surface, No glow cutting through the dark, just the rig standing still like it had finally decided to rest. That kind of quiet was dangerous in a way. Noise never was, because it made exhaustion feel justified, almost earned. I remember leaning against a bulkhead and thinking that closing my eyes for a minute wouldn't count as sleep. Not really, just a pause. The rig changes when it's calm for too long, though no one ever says that out loud. The usual vibrations softened, the constant reminders of machinery faded into something smoother, almost comforting, like breathing. You don't notice anymore. My body took that as permission to shut down piece by piece, starting with my shoulders, then my jaw, then the tension behind my eyes. I kept telling myself I was alert, that I could feel the cold air and smell the oil and salt, but awareness isn't the same as wakefulness. The stillness felt intentional, as if the rig itself wanted me heavy and slow. I tried to fight it by walking the long way between checkpoints, dragging my hand along the rail to stay grounded in sensation. Every step echoed too softly, like the sound had somewhere else to be, and that bothered me more than it should have. The darkness didn't feel empty, it felt occupied, patient, as though it had learned my habits and was waiting for the moment. I stopped resisting. I remember thinking about how sleep steals time without asking, how you never feel the exact second you lose control. That thought scared me enough to keep moving for a while longer. The chair in the monitoring room was my real enemy, molded perfectly to support a body that wanted to give up. I sat down only because my legs were trembling, telling myself I'd stand again after checking the gauges. The screens glowed steadily, nothing out of range, nothing demanding urgency, and that's when the weight behind my eyes deepened into something almost painful. I blinked harder than necessary, forcing my vision to stay sharp, but the numbers started to blur anyway. The calm didn't feel natural. It felt staged, like a trap designed for tired people who thought they'd earned rest. What frightened me most was how reasonable sleep began to feel. I started justifying it in small ways, telling myself that the worst was over, that the lights hadn't appeared in hours, that nothing ever happened when the rig was this quiet. Those thoughts came too easily, lining up neatly, smoothing over the warnings I'd been given when I first took the job. I wondered how many watchmen before me had reached this same point, sitting exactly where I was, convinced that rules were meant for louder, more dangerous nights. The idea that exhaustion could rewrite judgment felt more unsettling than any movement beneath the water. I don't remember deciding to rest my head on my arms, but I remember the sensation of the desk pressing into my forehead. The room felt warmer with my eyes closed, insulated from the cold I'd been fighting all night, and that comfort almost pulled me under completely. There was a strange clarity in those seconds, a false sense of safety, like being wrapped in something familiar. I told myself I was still listening, still aware, but awareness without sight is a fragile thing. The last thought I had before slipping was that nothing had happened, and maybe nothing would. What followed didn't feel like sleep the way I understood it. There were no dreams, no images, just a heavy absence where time should have been, like a section of memory cut cleanly away. I didn't feel myself drifting or waking. I simply wasn't there for a while, and that gap terrified me more than any nightmare could have. When I came back, it was to a sensation of pressure, as if the air itself had thickened around me. My heart was already racing before I understood why. The screens were different, though I couldn't immediately say how. The numbers were still in range, the graph still steady, but something about the glow felt wrong, too bright or too close. My neck ached from the way I'd been slumped, and that pain grounded me enough to notice the silence had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was strained, like something holding its breath. I checked the clock and felt a cold wave roll through me when I saw the missing time. I had been gone longer than any accidental doze should allow. I stood up too fast, dizzy, and grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself. The rig groaned faintly, not the usual mechanical sound, but something deeper, slower, as if the structure itself was adjusting to my movement. I suddenly felt exposed, like waking up in a room and realizing someone had been watching you the entire time. My skin prickled with the certainty that my absence hadn't gone unnoticed. Sleep hadn't protected me. It had removed whatever thin barrier awareness provided. As I stepped back onto the deck, the night air hit me hard, sharp and unforgiving, stripping away the last remnants of comfort. The ocean looked unchanged, black and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something important, something I wasn't meant to miss. The calm now felt artificial, a stage reset after a performance I hadn't seen. I kept scanning the water, the horizon, the structure beneath my feet, trying to catch evidence of what had happened while I was gone. The rest of the shift passed slowly, every second stretched tight with vigilance and regret. I didn't sit down again, didn't let myself relax, even when my body screamed for rest. The knowledge that sleep could take more than consciousness from me settled heavily in my chest. When morning finally came, it felt less like relief and more like survival, the kind that leaves questions instead of answers. I walked off the rig, knowing that staying awake wasn't about discipline anymore, but about being present when the rig decided to remind me what I'd missed. I didn't learn Rule 11. Never believe the rig will let you leave unchanged once you've learned all the rules, from a handbook or a warning spoken out loud. It settled into me slowly, like a truth my body understood before my mind caught up. My final shift began without ceremony, the kind of night that pretends to be ordinary, so you won't guard yourself too closely. The sea was calm again, dark and unreadable, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. That feeling scared me more than the lights ever had, because it felt like permission. I moved through my tasks with mechanical precision, every step familiar, every sound expected, and that familiarity made me uneasy. The rig felt less like a workplace, and more like a memory I was already replaying, as if I were walking through something that had already happened. I noticed small things that shouldn't have mattered: how my boots fit differently, how the rail felt warmer under my hand, how the air carried a weight I couldn't name. It was as if the structure had adjusted itself around me over time, learning me the way I had learned it. I realized then that knowing the rules hadn't just kept me alive, it had shaped how I existed here. There were no lights beneath the surface that night, and that absence felt intentional rather than comforting. I kept scanning the water anyway, unable to stop myself, aware that vigilance had become instinct rather than effort. My thoughts drifted to what came next, to leaving the rig, to sleeping in a bed that didn't move, to silence that wasn't watching me. The idea felt distant, unreal, like imagining a place I'd only seen in photographs. I tried to picture myself away from this structure, but the image wouldn't settle, like my mind refused to accept a version of me that wasn't standing here. At one point, I caught my reflection in a darkened window, and didn't immediately recognize the man looking back. My eyes looked sharper, more alert, but also older in a way that had nothing to do with age. There was something tightened in my expression, a restraint that hadn't been there before, like I was constantly bracing for something just out of view. I wondered if this was what the rule meant, not a physical change but a permanent adjustment to perception. The rig hadn't harmed me directly, it had taught me, and teaching leaves marks you can't scrub off. As the hours passed, memories from earlier shifts surfaced uninvited, moments I hadn't thought about in days. I remembered standing at the edge and stopping myself, sitting in the monitoring room, fighting sleep, watching objects disappear into the water and forcing myself to let them go. Each memory carried the same underlying sensation, a tightening in my chest that told me those choices were still happening, still ongoing. It occurred to me that the rules hadn't ended when the situation passed. They continued living inside me, guiding reactions even when the trigger was gone. That realization made the thought of leaving feel less like escape and more like separation. Near the end of the shift, I felt a strange pressure, not physical, but directional, like the rig was paying attention in a different way. The usual background sensations faded, replaced by a heavy awareness that made every movement feel observed. I didn't see or hear anything unusual, and that made it worse because there was no single thing to point to as the cause. I thought about how rules are supposed to end, how following them is meant to lead back to normal life. Standing there, I understood that this rule wasn't about behavior anymore. it was about expectation. I checked the clock repeatedly, watching the minutes thin out, feeling less relieved with each one that passed. The idea of someone else taking my place didn't comfort me the way it should have. Instead, I felt an unexpected pull, a reluctance I hadn't prepared for, like leaving something unfinished, even though every task was complete. I realized I didn't know who I would be without the constant edge of awareness, without the quiet calculations that had become second nature. The rig had given me structure, boundaries, and a way to survive, and I wasn't sure what remained when those were removed. When the shift finally ended, there was no dramatic moment, no final sign or warning, just the slow lightening of the sky and the sound of activity returning. I gathered my things methodically, delaying in small, meaningless ways, straightening objects that didn't need it, checking spaces I'd already cleared. Each step toward departure felt heavier than the last, as if I were moving against a current no one else could feel. I wondered if the others noticed anything different about me, or if the change was subtle enough to pass unnoticed. The thought that it might follow me beyond the rig unsettled me deeply. As I walked away for the last time, I didn't look back at the water, not because I wasn't curious, but because I understood that some habits don't end cleanly. The absence of the lights didn't feel like safety. It felt like restraint being lifted, like something choosing not to reveal itself anymore. I carried the rules with me, not as instructions but as reflexes, ready to surface whenever the world went quiet in the wrong way. That was when I understood the true weight of Rule 11, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. I'm not sure when it started, but even now, far from the rig, I still measure silence, still avoid edges, still stay awake when everything feels too calm. The rules didn't stay behind on that structure in the ocean. They rewrote how I respond to the dark, to stillness, to myself. Sometimes when I catch that familiar tension settling in my chest, I feel like I'm back there again, standing watch, waiting for something I can't see. I should probably stop talking now, because I think I just noticed that feeling returning. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.